Hello world, this is Stevenson speaking, and today I am here to analyze, explicate, and synthesize two poems. So before we start, let me introduce you to the two poems that I will analyze today, which are My Shadow by Robert Louis Stevenson and Shadow Race by Silverstein. So what do these poems have in common? These poems are similar in that they include the principal motif of shadow. The symbolism of shadow differs for each poem, but both have similar mechanisms in conveying their theme. These poems convey the unifying theme that one must focus on one's goal to reach it. So let's start off with My Shadow by Robert Louis Stevenson. My Shadow is divided into 4 quatrains with regular rhymes following each other. When we look at the meter of this poem, we can see that most lines have a pattern of 14 and 15 syllables, but we fall into this specific line, which is an outlier with 13 syllables, and the importance of this line will be examined later. Let's take a look at the symbols of the poem. First of all, shadow. Shadow represents an adversary or a source of distraction. If you look at the context of each stanza, you can see that the narrator and the shadow are constantly in competition. Next, words like bed, grow, and play represent the obstacles that the narrator and the shadow both have to face. Who goes to bed first? How does each person grow? How does each play? These are all criteria for determining whether the narrator or the shadow is an advantage. Moving on, there is the sun. The sun represents the source of competition between the narrator and the shadow. Let's look at the line, one morning very early before the sun was up. Here we can see that when the sun is down and there is no source of competition, the narrator is actually focused on what one is doing. Finally, the shining dew on every buttercup. This represents the narrator's focus towards one's goal. The reason is that the narrator does not start off the stanza by fussing about the shadow's action. Instead, he or she actually focuses on what one is doing. These symbols all contribute to the theme that one must concentrate towards one's goal to reach it by becoming components. Components of what? Components which will be used to contrast the outcomes of not focusing and focusing. Moving on to line and stanza breaks. So in My Shadow, each stanza provides an aspect of the competition between the narrator and the shadow, and what is interesting about this poem is that when you look at the first 2 lines of each stanza, we readers can actually understand what the whole stanza will be about. So in the first stanza, there is the introduction about the shadow and then the aspect of competition in the bed. The second stanza talks about how the shadow grows. The third stanza talks about how the shadow plays. And then the final stanza is kind of confusing because it does not immediately talk about the competition with the shadow, and instead talks about a setting and then what the narrator does, him or herself. So this stanza is actually emphasized by the other ones because it is the only one that stands out. And right here, the narrator does not ramble about how the shadow is doing and instead tries to concentrate on what he or she is doing right now. The consequences of adopting that attitude is that the narrator eventually wakes up before the shadow, then eventually has an advantage over the shadow, implying the message that one must concentrate towards one's goal to reach it. And now we are on to diction and imagery. So in this poem, the words underlined in pink provide an aspect of the competition between the narrator and the shadow. So words like before and behind provide words of order, and words like taller and little provide words of comparison. Words like jump and shoot are actually words that can be used specifically when 2 elements or people are competing with each other. Words like in blue provide images, and then the importance and the flow of the impressions that these images give to us will be examined in tone and mood right now. So diction and imagery and tone and mood are closely interrelated. Diction and imagery are the mechanisms which form tone and mood. In turn, because diction and imagery alone cannot provide complete connections to the theme, Tone and mood help these elements encompass a significance, which can then be synthesized into a theme. So let's first start by taking a look at the tone. In the first stanza, in line number 2, and what can be the use of him is more than I can see, this line actually tries to tell us that the shadow is something more than a dark globby thing. And by employing this line, the narrator develops a foreshadowing tone as well as a competitive tone because the narrator is in competition with the shadow. In the second stanza, the narrator starts to develop a weakly mocking tone as you look at line number 6, not at all like proper children, which is always very slow. Now, in this line, the narrator talks about something that is not necessarily nice about the shadow. And then the narrator also continues to develop a competitive tone because of the continuous competition. In stanza number 3, now the narrator gets extremely mocking as one employs words like make a fool, coward, and shame. And then there is a complete reversal in the narrator's attitude as you look at words like shining dew on every buttercup or I rose and found, and you can see that these words do not talk about the shadow but about what the narrator oneself is doing. So now let's take a look at the mood, and we will look at this by taking a look at the images that certain words form. So in the first stanza, ghost in and out actually forms a pretty much calm and peaceful image that well suits for an introductory stanza. Moving on to stanza number 2, words like India rubber ball start to create a tense feeling in ourselves because as you look at this picture of the India rubber ball, it is ready to fly or jump anywhere. Our feelings start to become like this ball too. Moving on to the third stanza, words like mock create a very uneasy feeling in ourselves. If you look at these kinds of picture, we can feel that the actions that these characters take are not morally right for one to do. Words like coward create images like these where we can sense a feeling of uncomfortableness. Finally, in the last stanza, words like shining dew on every buttercup form rather calm and peaceful atmospheres, and then when the narrator eventually gains an advantage over the shadow by waking up before it, we readers can feel relieved that the narrator has finally regained one's focus, and then we can also feel complete because the narrator seems to have achieved a certain goal. So let's summarize tone and mood analysis. Tone and mood change from stanza to stanza. As the tone shifts, the consequences of adopting certain attitudes also change. We as readers can observe this flow and develop a continuous flow of feelings. When the narrator does not focus and continues to ramble on about what the shadow is doing, we feel uneasy. And the narrator correspondingly achieves nothing for oneself. However, when the narrator focuses and just thinks about what one is doing individually, we feel relieved and complete. The narrator consequently gains advantage over the shadow. Therefore, tone and mood in My Shadow lead to the theme that one must concentrate towards one's objective to reach it. Now that we have synthesized Stevenson's My Shadow, let's take a look at Silverstein's Shadow Race. There is no specific rhyme for this poem except for the 2 last lines. These lines form a regular rhyme. Please ignore the slant rhyme sign on this slide. The meter of this poem is interesting. The first 4 lines have a regular meter of 8 and 7 syllables. The last 3 lines have an irregular syllable pattern. Moving on to symbol. Race symbolizes competition, and it forms a basic setting where the narrator faces one's adversities. Speaking of adversities, shadow symbolizes an adversity or an obstacle to overcome. Sun symbolizes the goal that the narrator aspires to achieve. These symbols overall contribute to the theme that one must focus towards one's goal to reach it, because these provide the components which will then provide a comparison between different attitudes developed throughout the poem. Next are line and stanza breaks. Silverstein's poem is divided into two sets. Set number 1 is lines 1 to 4. It has a regular meter and a long ending, which I will explain later on. Set number 2 is lines 5 to 7. It has an irregular meter and a concise ending. The endings of these sets are the results of developing specific attitudes in each set. The differences in length imply different consequences when developing different attitudes towards one's goal. When one does not focus towards one's goal, then one despairs over and leaves a lingering feeling. When one actually focuses and looks towards one's goal, one has nothing more to say except that one feels triumphant. Through these line breaks, we can see that one achieves one goal by focusing towards it. Moving on to diction and imagery. The words in pink describe the competitive aspect of the poem. It also demonstrates the hardships encountered throughout one's life. The words in blue produce images for the reader. When we look at these images, we can see contrasts in one's attitude towards an objective. On the left picture, the sun is at the back of a person. In this state, one feels the urge to keep fretting and worrying about the hardships of the adversities as one competes with obstacles. On the other pictures, however, people are facing towards the sun. They look at their goals and do not fuss about the shadow that lies behind them. Here, the difference in these pictures is the focus. By looking at these pictures formed, we can infer the message that achievement of one's goal comes from concentrating towards it. Also, the images help readers perceive the tone and mood of the poem. Let's look at the tone and mood of the poem. So each set has a set of tones and moods. In the first set, which talks about how the narrator loses every time one does not look towards the sun, the narrator seems very defeated. Looking at lines 3 and 4, it always ran ahead of me, always got the best of me, we can see how the narrator seems so powerless and defeated. And when we also look at line number 2, when the sun was at my back, the sun seems to have a sort of power or control over the narrator. We readers, because we have confronted obstacles, because we face hardships throughout our life all the time, we develop a caring feeling towards the narrator as well as sensing something depressing around the poem. In the second set, however, the narrator completely changes one's attitude and becomes more determined and triumphant. Looking at line number 6, when my face was towards the sun, my face becomes the subject of the poem, and that word seems to have a control over the goal and the entire trajectory that the narrator is trying to go through. Eventually, at the end, with the concise ending, the narrator shows that there is nothing more to add and that the narrator already feels triumphant. We readers who have already developed a caring feeling towards the narrator also develop a supporting feeling towards the narrator as one actually changes the attitude and tries to confront the goal face to face. And when the narrator reaches one's goal, we readers feel a completeness in ourselves for having supported the narrator. We can now see that the tone of set 1 opposes the tone of set 2. We readers also feel this difference by sensing different atmospheres in each set. When the narrator is not focused towards one's goal, the set seems powerless, depressing, and even tragic. When the narrator focuses towards one's goal, the entire set seems to have a sense of strength and vigor. Moreover, because the reader is absorbed into that flow of the poem, tone and mood help this poem convey the theme that one must concentrate towards one's goal to reach it. Now we have synthesized both poems. So back to the base, how do these poems connect? These poems have a unifying motif of shadow. However, the symbolism of shadow in each poem is a little different. In Stevenson's My Shadow, shadow symbolizes an adversary. In Silverstein's Shadow Race, shadow symbolizes an adversity. Nevertheless, both poems use line and stanza breaks, diction and imagery, and tone and mood in the same way. These literary elements emphasize the difference between concentrating and not concentrating towards a goal. Both poems lead to the unifying theme that one reaches an objective by focusing towards it. So imagine yourself in a competition and then boom, it has started. What will you do? Will you focus, will you deviate, or will you just give up? By reading these poems, we readers can realize that if you want to win, if you want to reach your goal, you have to concentrate, look towards it, and then strike towards it. Thank you for listening.